My name is Martha Richardson. I'm 65 years old, and just 5 days after my heart stopped twice on an operating table, my own daughter screamed, "We're not your servants," when I asked for a simple glass of water. That was in the beautiful home I had given her, a house I secretly bought with her dead father's life insurance money. That was the moment I stopped being a mother and started being a strategist. They never saw what was coming. It's a long and painful story, but I have a feeling someone out there, right now, needs to hear it. Before I get into it, I'd love to know where you're all listening from. Could you do me a favor and let me know in the comments what time it is in your part of the world? It makes this big world feel a little smaller, knowing we're all connected, sharing stories in the quiet moments of our day. The journey home from the cardiac unit was a study in silence. A thick, suffocating silence that was more exhausting than the 5 days I'd spent tethered to beeping machines. My daughter, Olivia, gripped the steering wheel of her late model SUV, her knuckles white. It wasn't from the tension of driving her fragile mother home. It was the tight-lipped impatience of someone whose schedule had been inconveniently disrupted. Her husband, James, sat in the passenger seat, his head bowed, the blue light of his phone reflecting on his face as he scrolled endlessly, lost in a world that had no room for me. Every bump and dip in the asphalt sent a fresh jolt of fire through my chest. The surgical incision, a neat line held together with staples and glue, felt like a zipper of pain being pulled open and shut with every breath. I clutched a small pillow to my sternum, a trick a kind nurse had taught me, but it did little to dull the sharp, grinding ache. This wasn't any surgery. The doctor had been clear. "We lost you twice on the table, Martha," he'd said, his eyes kind but serious. "Your heart stopped. You are a miracle." A miracle my own daughter seemed to view as a profound annoyance. When we finally turned onto their street, lined with manicured lawns and houses that all looked comfortably expensive, I felt a wave of dizziness. This street, this house, it was all supposed to represent the culmination of my life's work, of my love. Now it felt like enemy territory. The two-story colonial with its cheerful blue shutters and welcoming front porch seemed to mock me. I had poured my heart, my soul, and a significant portion of my husband's legacy into that house. James finally put his phone away as the car rolled to a stop in the driveway. He got out and opened my door with a sigh, offering a hand as if I were a piece of luggage he was obligated to unload. "Easy there," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. I ignored his hand, using the car door to steady myself as I painstakingly swung my legs onto the pavement. Each movement was a negotiation with pain. Once inside, the cool, conditioned air did little to soothe the fire in my chest. The house was immaculate, decorated in the sterile, impersonal style of a magazine photo shoot, all grays and whites with not a single family photo in sight. All the warmth, the history, the lived-in comfort of the home that Robert and I had built had been erased. I navigated my way to the large plush armchair in the corner of the living room. It was one of the few pieces they had kept from my old life, a familiar island in a sea of cold modernity. Sinking into its depths felt like a surrender. My throat was a desert. The dry, recycled air of the hospital, the endless medications, the sheer terror of the past week had left me dehydrated in a way that felt soul deep. My voice was a weak, raspy thing when I finally spoke. "Could one of you get me a glass of water, please?" Olivia, who had just dropped her designer purse on the marble-topped console table, froze. She turned, and the look on her face was one of such pure, unadulterated irritation that it stole the breath from my lungs. It was the look you might give a telemarketer, not your mother, who had just come home from the brink of death. "Seriously?" she snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. I blinked, the simple request dying on my lips. I just got home. The drive. It took a lot out of me. She crossed her arms across her chest, a gesture of defiance I knew all too well. It was the same gesture she'd use as a teenager when I'd asked her to clean her room. "And what?" she said, gesturing vaguely with her head. "The kitchen is right there. You have legs." Before I could even process a cruelty of her words, James chimed in from the couch, where he was already back to scrolling on his phone. He didn't even bother to look up. He just chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound that scraped against my raw nerves. "Leave her be, Liv. She's just acting like she's dying. It was just a little heart procedure." A little heart procedure. The phrase detonated in the quiet room. The surgeon's words echoed in my head. "We lost you twice on the table, Martha," he said, his eyes kind but serious. "Your heart stopped. You are a miracle." A miracle my own daughter seemed to view as a profound annoyance. When she delivered the final, fatal blow, the words that would sever the last thread of hope I had been clinging to. "We're not your servants, Mom." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the tinny, cheerful music from a game show on the television. I felt a physical pain in my chest that had nothing to do with the incision. It was the pain of a heart breaking. A pain far deeper and far more brutal than any surgeon's knife could inflict. I had poured every ounce of myself into this child. My time, my salary when I worked 2 jobs to build her college fund, my love. And this was my return on investment? Contempt. Slowly, grimly, I began the arduous process of pushing myself out of the chair. Each inch was a victory against the searing pain. I'd get my own water. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me beg. As I finally got to my feet, swaying, I heard Olivia mutter to James, "Don't want you falling and making even more work for us." As I took the first shaky, agonizing step towards the kitchen, my eyes fell on the empty spot on the mantelpiece where a large silver-framed photo of Robert and I used to sit. It was gone, replaced by a soulless, abstract sculpture. In that moment, I knew. This wasn't just disrespect. This was an erasure. They were trying to erase my past, my history, my very presence. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I could not let that happen. That night, sleep was a foreign country I couldn't find the passport for. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Olivia's face, her features twisted in a sneer of contempt. I heard James's dismissive chuckle. The physical pain from my surgery was a roaring fire, but the pain of their betrayal was a universe of ice, cold and vast and terrifying. I was adrift in it. Around 3 a.m, I abandoned the pretense of rest. The house was shrouded in a heavy silence, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but full of unspoken things. I eased myself out of the plush guest bed, my old master bedroom having been redecorated into a meditation space Olivia never used, and began a slow, painful shuffle down the hallway. As I passed their bedroom, the door slightly ajar, I heard James's voice, a low, urgent mumble. He was a restless sleeper, prone to talking in his dreams. I paused, my hand on the wall to steady myself, and listened. "Double down. The cards have to turn. Get you the money next week, I swear." The words were disjointed, but the meaning was sickeningly clear. Gambling. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a certainty. It explained everything. The hushed, angry phone calls I'd occasionally overheard, the way James always seemed to be short on cash, despite Olivia's decent salary, the string of bad luck investments he'd complained about. They weren't just ungrateful and cruel. They were desperate and deceitful, and they were looking at me not as a mother, but as a solution to their financial problems, a walking, talking ATM. A cold fury, different from the hot anger of hurt feelings, began to solidify in my gut. This was calculated. This was predatory. I continued my slow pilgrimage down the stairs, each step a testament to my resolve. My destination was the small room at the back of the house that had once been Robert's study. It was the one space they had left largely untouched, as if his quiet, steadfast presence still lingered among the shelves of worn books and the faint, sweet scent of cherry pipe tobacco that clung to the curtains. Against the far wall, partially hidden by a tall ficus plant, was the old steel safe. It was a relic from Robert's contracting business, heavy and imposing. Olivia knew it existed, of course, but she believed it held nothing more than dusty blueprints and his modest coin collection. She had once asked for the combination, just in case, and I had politely refused. Now I understood why she had asked. My fingers, though stiff with arthritis and trembling with adrenaline, found the familiar numbers on the combination dial. Robert had said it himself the day we brought Olivia home from the hospital. The heavy steel door swung open with a well-oiled whisper. Inside, past the neat stacks of old tax returns and property deeds, was a large, handsome portfolio bound in dark blue leather. The gold embossing on the front was simple and elegant. The Richardson Family Revocable Living Trust. This was Robert's final masterpiece. He was a man who built things to last: houses, furniture, relationships. He believed in solid foundations. Years ago, after a close friend's ugly divorce had nearly cost him his business and his children's inheritance, Robert had become obsessed with protecting our assets. He'd spent weeks researching, and then he'd marched us into the office of the best estate planning lawyer in the city. "Martha," he had said, his big, calloused hand covering mine, "I'm not leaving anything to chance. You and Liv will be taken care of. Always." The trust was his fortress. It wasn't a simple will that could be contested or a gift that could be assumed. It was a living, breathing legal entity. Every significant asset we owned was transferred into it: our savings, our stocks, Robert's life insurance policy, and the very house we lived in. The document was a marvel of legal foresight, but its most brilliant clause was the one concerning trusteeship. While he was alive, we were co-trustees. The moment the doctor signed his death certificate, I became the sole, undisputed trustee. I had absolute power. I could buy, sell, lease, and manage every asset as I saw fit. Olivia was the beneficiary, yes, but only in the future tense. She would inherit the kingdom, but not until the queen was gone. When I gave them this house, I hadn't signed over a deed. I had, as trustee, amended the trust to allow them to reside in the property. They were tenants in a home they believed they owned. Tenants who had just flagrantly violated the terms of their lease. I had kept this from Olivia not to be secretive, but to be kind. A gift feels different than a legal arrangement. I wanted her to feel the pure joy of ownership, not the weight of obligation. My trust in her was absolute, and absolutely, catastrophically wrong. As I sat there in the dark, the cool leather of the portfolio a comforting weight on my lap, I heard a floorboard creak upstairs. Then their voices, drifting down the stairwell. "You sure you heard something?" Olivia whispered. "Probably just her rattling around," James grumbled. His voice dropped, becoming conspiratorial. "You know that diamond necklace Robert gave her? The one she never wears? We could say we had it appraised for insurance. She's so out of it from the meds, she'd never notice if it went missing for a while. It would solve our problem with Vinny." My blood turned to ice. They were plotting to steal from me, to steal a gift from my dead husband to pay a bookie named Vinny. That was the moment the last vestige of the loving, forgiving mother died. She bled out right there on the floor of Robert's study. In her place, something else was born.
something colder, harder, and far more dangerous. I placed the trust documents back inside the safe. The heavy door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the silent house. It was the sound of a vault closing and a cage opening. They thought they had me trapped. They had no idea I was the one holding the key. The next morning, I moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a hunter. The pain in my chest was a dull, manageable throb, a physical reminder of the battle I had survived and the new one I was about to begin. My grief had burned away, leaving behind a core of cold, hard resolve. I waited until I saw James leave in his car, probably off to chase his losses or beg for more time from his mysterious Vinny. Olivia was in the shower, the sound of the water drumming a steady rhythm. It was the perfect window of opportunity. I retreated to the quiet of Robert's study, closed the door, and dialed the number I now knew by heart. "McHill's office, how may I direct your call?" "Sarah, it's Martha Richardson. I need to speak with Michael, please. It's a matter of some urgency."
Martha, I was about to call to see how you were settling in. Is everything all right? Not exactly, Michael, I said, and then I told him. I didn't cry or raise my voice. I simply laid out the facts, one after another, like a prosecutor presenting evidence. The refusal of water, the cruel words, the conversation I'd overheard about my necklace and a man named Vinny, the way they were trying to control my medication. There was a long, charged silence on the other end of the line. When Michael finally spoke, his voice had lost all its friendly warmth. It was the voice of a lawyer preparing for war. It was cold, sharp, and utterly furious on my behalf. "Martha, this is unacceptable. This is beyond a family squabble. This is predatory behavior. We need to act, and we need to act now." "I agree," I said, "but I want to do this my way, Michael. Strategically. I don't want to just win. I want them to understand why they've lost." "I understand completely," he said, a hint of admiration in his tone. "What's your first move?" "I need you to come to the house this afternoon. Let's say 2 o'clock. Tell your secretary to call and make the appointment. Make it sound official. And when you come, please bring a copy of the family trust, a very official-looking, bound copy." "Consider it done," he said. "I'll see you at 2. The hours leading up to the meeting were a quiet torment. Olivia emerged from her shower and proceeded to ignore me for the rest of the morning, communicating only through pointed sighs and the loud clatter of dishes. She made a great show of taking a business call in the living room, talking loudly about deadlines and deliverables, a clear performance meant to show me how important and busy she was. At one point, she came over to my chair. "I'm going to need to reschedule your follow-up with the surgeon," she announced, not looking at me but at her phone. "I can't get the time off work. My promotion is on the line. I can't be seen as unreliable." I just nodded, my eyes on the pages of my book. "That's fine, dear. We'll work it out." My placid agreement seemed to infuriate her more than an argument would have. She huffed and stalked away. She was expecting a fight, a please, some emotional reaction she could use as leverage. I gave her nothing. I was a placid lake, and she had no idea of the powerful currents moving deep beneath the surface. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. I watched with grim satisfaction as Olivia opened it, her practiced corporate smile faltering when she saw Michael O'Connor standing on the porch, looking formal and imposing in his dark suit, a thick leather briefcase in his hand. "Mr. O'Connor," she said, her voice a little tight. "What a surprise." "Michael, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please come in. Olivia, dear, would you get my lawyer a glass of water?" The look she shot me was pure venom, but in front of a guest, a lawyer no less, she was trapped. She retreated to the kitchen, her movements stiff with resentment. James, who had returned home, wandered into the room, a look of wary confusion on his face. Michael sat in the wing-back chair opposite me, placing his briefcase on the floor beside him. He was a master of courtroom theater, and he knew exactly what this was. "Now, Martha," he began, his voice resonating with professional gravity, "you mentioned you wanted to review some of the core provisions of the trust, specifically regarding your authority as sole trustee." He opened his briefcase and pulled out the beautifully bound copy of the trust document. Olivia had returned and was now hovering near the doorway with James, both of them pretending to be occupied, but listening to every word with rapt attention. I leaned forward, my hands clasped in my lap. "Yes, Michael, there's been some confusion lately. I just want to be perfectly clear on my rights regarding the assets, particularly this residence." Michael opened the document to a tabbed page. He didn't need to read it, he knew it by heart, but the gesture was for them. "Certainly," he said, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Under Article 4, Section B, as the sole living trustee, you, Martha, retain absolute and singular authority over all properties held within the trust. This includes the power to manage, lease, sell, or otherwise dispose of any asset as you see fit without the consent of any named beneficiary." I watched their faces. James went utterly still, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of a chair. Olivia's carefully constructed composure began to crumble, a subtle tremor starting in her lower lip. I decided to twist the knife just a little. "And, Michael, just for my own clarity, that authority would include determining who is permitted to live on a trust property. For instance, if I felt their presence was detrimental to my well-being or the financial health of the trust?" Michael met my gaze, a flicker of grim understanding in his eyes. "Yes, Martha," he confirmed, his voice booming with legal certainty. "That power is yours and yours alone. Any resident on a trust property is solely at your discretion, a discretion that can be revoked at any time for any reason you deem sufficient." The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the quarter hour, the sound like a death knell in the suddenly silent room. The warning shot had been fired. It wasn't just a shot across the bow, it was a cannonball that had ripped through the hull of their arrogant assumptions. They weren't own-homers, they weren't in control, they were guests in my house, and they had just been put on notice. The aftermath of Michael's visit was a thick, poisonous fog that settled over the house. The open hostility vanished, driven underground. In its place was a cloying, manipulative sweetness that was far more sinister. Olivia suddenly couldn't do enough for me. She brought me tea I didn't ask for, fluffed pillows that were already comfortable, and spoke to me in a soft, gentle voice that made my skin crawl. James would ask about my health with a pained, solicitous expression, offering to run errands he had no intention of completing. They were a performance, a desperate, clumsy attempt to prove they were the loving, dutiful children they had so spectacularly failed to be. They thought they could undo years of neglect and weeks of cruelty with a few days of good behavior. They misunderstood the nature of the wound they had inflicted. It wasn't a scratch that could be healed with a bandage. It was a deep, structural fracture. Their most insidious tactic was the control over my medication. Olivia had taken possession of my prescription painkillers, doling them out with the sanctimonious air of a pharmacist. "Here you go, Mom. We don't want you taking too many and getting confused, do we?" They were building a narrative. Every time I forgot a word, every time I seemed tired or frail, they would exchange a look of deep, sorrowful concern meant entirely for my benefit. They were trying to gaslight me into believing I was incompetent, planting the seeds of doubt they could later use to challenge my authority as trustee. Poor mother, she's not herself since the surgery. She's making rash decisions. I saw their endgame with perfect, chilling clarity. I knew I couldn't fight them on their terms. A direct confrontation about the pills would be twisted into proof of my addiction or paranoia. An argument would be evidence of my emotional instability. They had laid a clever trap, so I decided to lay a better one. I would use the very weakness they were trying to weaponize against me. I would use my fragile health as a Trojan horse. The opportunity came 2 days later. It was a dreary, overcast afternoon. James was pacing in the living room, his cell phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, angry whisper. I couldn't hear all of it, but I caught the words, extension and I'm good for it, and 1 more week. He was in trouble with his bookie. He was desperate. And desperation, as I knew, makes a person reckless. I waited until he was off the phone, his face pale and slick with sweat. Olivia was in the kitchen, noisily loading the dishwasher. The stage was set. I was sitting in my armchair, a book open on my lap. I took a deep, silent breath, summoning every ounce of memory from the terrifying moments in the hospital. I let out a soft, breathy groan, then another, a little louder this time. I pressed my hand dramatically to my chest, right over the incision site. "Oh," I gasped, letting the book slide from my lap and fall to the floor with a soft thud. "Oh, no." Olivia appeared in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in her hand, her face a mask of irritation. "What is it now?" she demanded. I didn't answer. I let my head fall back against the chair, my eyes wide. I began to breathe in short, shallow gasps, mimicking the terrifying feeling of not being able to draw a full breath. "My chest," I wheezed, my voice a strained whisper. "The pain, it's like before." I saw a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. She thought it was a ploy for attention. But then, James rushed into the room, drawn by the commotion. He saw me, and his face, already pale with his own troubles, turned ashen. "What's wrong with her?" he hissed at Olivia, his voice tight with alarm. "She's just being dramatic," Olivia started to say, but her own voice lacked conviction. The image of me gasping and clutching my chest was too visceral, too close to the real thing. This was the critical moment. I had to sell it. I let out a low, guttural moan, a sound of pure agony, and then I allowed my entire body to go slack. My arms slid off the armrest, dangling lifelessly towards the floor. I let my jaw go loose, my mouth falling slightly open. I focused on the memory of the darkness on the operating table, the feeling of slipping away, and I projected that terror onto my face. It was James who broke. The gambler, the man who understood risk and consequence. He wasn't seeing his mother-in-law, he was seeing a witness for the prosecution. He was seeing a potential custody battle for his own future if he were implicated in my death. He was seeing police reports, lawyers, and a jury. He was seeing a motive, a desperate man in debt to a loan shark, living with a wealthy elderly woman. "Call 911, he shrieked, his voice cracking with a terror that was entirely real. "Now, Olivia, for God's sake, call them now!" "But what if she's just faking it to get attention?" Olivia cried, her own resolve crumbling in the face of his raw panic. "And what if she's not?" he roared, his face contorted. "My God, if she dies, they'll call it negligent homicide. They'll look at my finances. They'll think we did this. They'll say we withheld her medication. Just call!" The raw, selfish fear in his voice was the most beautiful sound I ever heard. I heard Olivia's frantic, fumbling fingers on her phone, her panicked voice stammering our address to the 911 dispatcher. I lay there,
a still point in the center of their swirling chaos. They were running around the room, bumping into furniture, hissing at each other. They thought they were caught in a medical crisis. They had no idea they were caught in my trap. The distant, rising wail of a siren began to pierce the afternoon gloom. It wasn't the sound of an emergency, it was the sound of my cavalry riding to the rescue. The siren's cry grew from a distant wail to a piercing shriek that seemed to rattle the windows in their frames. It was the soundtrack to my liberation. From beneath my half-closed eyelids, I watched the frantic dance of my captors. "The door," James hissed, his eyes wide with terror. "Her bedroom door. Did you unlock it?" "I don't know. I can't remember where I put the key," Olivia wailed, her hands fluttering uselessly at her sides. Her carefully constructed composure had completely shattered, revealing the panicked, incompetent core beneath. Heavy, authoritative pounding echoed from the front door. "Paramedics, open the door!" "Coming!" James yelled, his voice cracking. He shot one last, terrified look at my limp form in the chair before bolting from the room. The next few moments were a blur of controlled chaos that I observed with a strange sense of detachment. I was both the cause of the storm and the calm at its center. I heard the front door open, James' stammering voice, and then the heavy tread of boots on the hardwood floor. Two paramedics, a man and a woman, entered the room with an air of focused urgency. They moved with a practiced efficiency that made Olivia and James's frantic floundering look even more pathetic. "Ma'am, can you hear me? My name is David," the male paramedic said, kneeling beside me. His voice was a calm anchor in the turbulent room. He gently took my wrist, his fingers searching for a pulse, his eyes scanning my face. His partner, a no-nonsense woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, turned to Olivia and James. "What happened? What are her symptoms?" "I don't know," Olivia cried, launching into a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. She just collapsed. She had major heart surgery last week. We've been so worried." David was already strapping a blood pressure cuff to my arm. He didn't take his eyes off me, but he asked a question that made the air in the room freeze. "I see the bedroom door down the hall is damaged. Was she in there?" James, who had followed them in, went pale. It, the door sticks," he lied, his voice thin and unconvincing. "It's an old house. I couldn't get it open in the panic, so I had to force it." David didn't dignify the lie with a response. He just made a small, non-committal grunt and shined a penlight into my eyes. I made sure my pupils didn't react more than they should. "Pupils are a bit sluggish but reactive," he murmured to his partner. He looked back down at me, his gaze professional but not unkind. "Ma'am, we're going to get you to the hospital and get you checked out. You're in good hands. Can you squeeze my fingers?" This was my cue, the moment the entire charade had been building towards. I let my eyelids flutter, as if the effort was monumental. I looked up at him, trying to fill my eyes with all the fear and desperation a helpless, imprisoned woman would feel. I gave his fingers the faintest squeezes, a pathetic twitch. Then, summoning a tear from the well of my very real misery, I let it trace the path down my temple. My voice was a dry, broken whisper, just loud enough for the two paramedics to hear, but too quiet for Olivia and James, who were hovering a few feet away. "They locked the door. From the outside," I breathed. "Took my phone, my pills." It was all it took. I saw a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in their professional demeanor. A hardening in their eyes, a tightening of their jaws. It was a look of recognition. They had seen this story before, in 100 different houses with 100 different victims. They were no longer just treating a patient, they were documenting a crime scene. "All right," David said, his voice now carrying a new, sharp edge of command. "Let's get her on the gurney and ready for transport now." They moved with renewed purpose. As they gently lifted me onto the gurney, I allowed myself to be a dead weight, my head lolling to the side. They strapped me in, and as they began to wheel me out of the room, Olivia rushed forward, her face a mask of frantic concern. "Is she going to be okay? Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry," she cried, reaching for my hand. I let my own hand remain limp and unresponsive, pulling it away slightly as if by instinct. Her touch felt like a brand. The female paramedic deftly stepped between us, blocking Olivia's path. "We'll know more at the hospital, ma'am," she said, her tone cool and clinical. "You can follow us in your car. Please give us some space to work." Being wheeled out of that front door was like being reborn. The cool, damp air on my face felt like the first breath of a free woman. They loaded me into the back of the ambulance, and the heavy doors swung shut, closing out the sight of my two tormentors standing on the porch, their faces a perfect tableau of filial devotion for the benefit of the neighbors who were now starting to peer out of their windows. The doors closed, sealing me into the quiet, sterile sanctuary of the ambulance. The siren began to climb, and as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, I opened my eyes. David, the paramedic, was checking my IV line. He caught my gaze in the reflection of the window. "Your heart rate is coming down, ma'am," he said, his voice soft and reassuring. "Your blood pressure is still high, but you're stable. You're safe now." I looked at this kind stranger, this man who had seen the truth in a single, whispered sentence. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the tears that streamed down my face were not part of an act. They were tears of profound, gut-wrenching, and glorious relief. My plan, my desperate gamble, had worked. I was out, and I had witnesses. The emergency room was an assault of bright fluorescent lights, the smell of bleach, and a cacophony of beeps, voices, and rolling carts. It was a world away from the suffocating quiet of the house. They wheeled me into a curtained cubicle, and I was immediately surrounded by a whirlwind of nurses and a young, serious-looking doctor. He was efficient, asking sharp questions while his hands moved with practiced skill, listening to my heart, checking my reflexes. "When did the chest pain start? On a scale of 1 to 10, any shortness of breath?" I answered him truthfully, in a weak but clear voice. "The pain started this afternoon. It was an 8. I couldn't breathe, but I think it was the stress." The doctor paused, looking up from his chart. "The stress?" "My children," I said, my voice dropping. "We had a disagreement. They've been very worried since my surgery. A little overprotective." I chose my words carefully. I didn't need to accuse them. The paramedic's report would do that for me. I just needed to plant the seed of a troubled home environment. He nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I see. The paramedic's report mentioned some unusual circumstances. A damaged door." "My son-in-law was panicked," I said, offering a weak, forgiving smile. "He couldn't get it open." He didn't comment, but I saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew he wasn't getting the whole story, but he also knew it wasn't his place to interrogate me. His job was to treat my physical symptoms. After a series of tests, an EKG, blood work, a chest x-ray, the doctor returned, pulling the curtain shut behind him. Olivia and James had been relegated to the waiting room, fuming, I was sure, at the delay. "Well, Mrs. Richardson," he said, his voice kind, "I have good news. Your cardiac enzymes are normal, and your EKG shows no signs of an acute event. You are not having a heart attack." I let out a shaky breath of relief I didn't have to fake. "But," he continued, "your blood pressure is dangerously high, and it's clear you're under extreme emotional distress. It's not uncommon after a significant trauma like open-heart surgery. Sometimes the mind can create physical symptoms that are very real. We call it stress-induced cardiomyopathy or broken heart syndrome. Given the situation, I suspect that's what we're dealing with." He gave me the perfect, medically sound explanation for my episode. I wasn't a manipulator, I was a patient. My weakness was my alibi. "I'd like to admit you overnight for observation," he said. "Get your blood pressure stabilized and have our hospital social worker come and speak to you in the morning, just to make sure you have a safe environment to return to." "Thank you, doctor," I whispered, my gratitude immense. "Thank you." Once he was gone, a nurse helped me get settled. She brought me a phone. My first call was to Michael. I relayed the events with the precision of a field commander reporting from the front lines. The faked attack, the 911 call, the paramedics' reaction, the doctor's diagnosis. Michael listened without interruption. When I finished, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Martha, they've handed us a gift, a legal, documented gift. Unlawful confinement, reckless endangerment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The petition to have them removed will no longer be a request. It will be a demand backed by a mountain of evidence. You did brilliantly. Now you rest. Let me do my work." My next call was to my neighbor, Frank Henderson, the retired detective. "Frank, it's Martha Richardson." "Martha! I saw them take you. I've been sitting here by the phone hoping you'd call. Are you okay?" His voice was a low rumble of genuine concern. "I'm safe, Frank. I'm at the hospital. They're keeping me overnight." I explained the doctor's diagnosis and my plan. "Frank, I need you. I need your professional eye." "You've got it," he said instantly. "I made a call. Spoke to the watch command down at the precinct. My name still carries a little weight. I told him I was a neighbor and a retired homicide detective, and that I had serious concerns about potential elder abuse at your address. I made sure the paramedics' report would be flagged and reviewed by a domestic violence officer. It won't just get filed away." I was stunned. He had anticipated my needs before I had even voiced them. "Frank, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," he grumbled, though I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "I hate bullies. Always have. You know, your husband, Robert, he once re-roofed my shed for free after a bad storm. Said that's what neighbors do. I'm just returning the favor."
Later that evening, a visitor appeared at my hospital room door. It was Frank, holding a worn copy of a mystery novel and a small paper cup of what smelled like real coffee. "Hospital coffee tastes like battery acid," he said by way of greeting. "Thought you could use an upgrade." He sat in the visitor's chair, not crowding me, just offering a quiet, solid presence. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the beeping of the machines a steady rhythm around us. "They're scared," he said finally, looking out the window. "I saw them come home. They look like a pair of cornered rats. That's when people are most dangerous, but also when they make the most mistakes." He looked at me, his gaze sharp. "You have them off balance. Keep them there." When Olivia and James were finally permitted to visit, their faces were a study in forced concern. "Mom, you gave us such a fright," Olivia said, rushing to my bedside. "We were so worried." I looked at my daughter, at the lie in her eyes, and I felt nothing but a vast, cold distance. I looked past her to my new friend, my ally, sitting quietly in the corner. Frank gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was a promise. You are not alone. "Yes," I said, my voice quiet but strong. "It was all very stressful." They didn't know it yet, but their world had already ended. The legal machinery was in motion. The witnesses were in place. All that was left was the final, public act of their downfall. The following day, I was discharged from the hospital. Michael arranged for a car to pick me up, ensuring I wouldn't have to endure the indignity of riding home with my jailers. When I walked through the front door, the house felt different. The air was thick with their fear. They hovered around me, offering to take my bag,
to make me tea, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were like actors in a play who had forgotten all their lines. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was a man in a crisp uniform, a professional process server. He handed a thick envelope to James, who accepted it with a trembling hand. I was sitting in my armchair, pretending to read, watching the scene unfold in the reflection of a glass-fronted cabinet. James tore the envelope open. His face, already pale, turned the color of ash. Olivia rushed over to read it over his shoulder. I heard her sharp intake of breath. "What is this?" James finally managed to say, his voice a strangled whisper, as he stormed into the living room. He threw the papers onto the coffee table in front of me. I placed my bookmark carefully in my novel before looking up. "It looks like a legal document," I said, my voice a placid C. "It's a notice to vacate. It says we have 30 days. 30 days? You can't do this. This is our home." "No, dear," I corrected her gently. "This is my home. It is a property held by the Richardson Family Trust, and I am the sole trustee. You have been residing here at my discretion, a discretion that, due to recent, well-documented events, has been revoked." I gestured to the papers. My lawyer, Mr. O'Connor, felt this was the most appropriate and legally sound course of action to ensure my future safety and well-being. "Your safety?" James sputtered, his fear momentarily eclipsed by a wave of indignant rage. "We were trying to help you. You were confused." "Were you helping me when you locked my bedroom door from the outside?" I asked, my voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel. "Were you helping me when you stole my medication, or were you helping me when you discussed selling my diamond necklace to pay off your bookie?" The color drained from his face again. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, no sound coming out. He had no idea I'd overheard that conversation. It was a direct hit, and he had no defense. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare. They swung wildly between sullen silence, tearful pleading, and bursts of angry threats. They promised they would change, they swore they would go to therapy, they begged for another chance. I remained serene, immovable. I was polite, distant, and utterly implacable. I was Mount Rushmore in a housecoat. Every plea was met with a calm, "That is a matter for you to discuss with my lawyer." Every threat was met with a quiet, "I'm sure Mr. O'Connor will be interested to hear about that." They were trapped. They had no money for a legal battle, and even if they did, they knew what would come out in court. The paramedics' report, the social worker's file, the testimony of a retired police detective. Their public image as loving, concerned children would be shattered forever. They began to pack, slowly, resentfully. The house was filled with the funereal sound of cardboard boxes being taped shut. They were defeated. But I knew that for the final lesson to be truly learned, the humiliation had to be complete. Justice needed not only to be done, but to be seen to be done. So on a Tuesday evening, with just over a week left before their deadline, I picked up the phone. I composed my face into an expression of wearied sadness and dialed Olivia's cell phone. "Hello?" she answered, her voice flat and dead. "It's your mother," I said, my own voice soft and laced with a manufactured sorrow. "What do you want?" "I've been thinking, all this ugliness, it's not what your father would have wanted. He loved this family. He cherished it. I was thinking, I want to do something for him. Before you leave, I'd like to host one last family dinner. This Saturday, I'll invite your Uncle David and Aunt Carol. We can share some memories of your father. We can close this chapter with some dignity. For him. There was a long, calculating silence on the other end. I could hear the desperate hope churning in her mind. She's caving. She feels guilty. If we get Uncle David and Aunt Carol here, they'll take our side. They can pressure her. This is our chance to turn it around. I suppose we could do that, she said finally, her voice cautious but unable to hide the flicker of renewed hope. Wonderful, I said, my voice dripping with a sweetness that was pure poison. I'll make his favorite, pot roast with Yorkshire pudding. I hung up the phone and allowed myself a small, grim smile. They thought they were coming to a peace summit. They had no idea they had just accepted a formal invitation to their own execution. The table would be set, the meal would be served, and their downfall would be the main course. The air in the house on Saturday evening was thick with a cloying, artificial peace. The rich aroma of slow-cooked pot roast and baking bread filled the rooms, a scent that for decades had been synonymous with family gatherings, laughter, and warmth. Tonight, it was the smell of a carefully laid trap. I had spent the day cooking, not out of love, but from a cold, calculated sense of theater. Every peeled potato, every chopped onion was a step in the choreography of their demise.
Robert's brother David, a stoic, kind-hearted man with Robert's same honest eyes, arrived first with his wife. Then came Robert's younger sister Carol, a woman whose heart was as big as her laugh. They were the keepers of our family's history, the living embodiment of the decency and love Robert had stood for. They hugged me at the door, their faces etched with a worried confusion. "Martha, are you sure this is a good idea?" David asked me in a low voice as I took his coat. "Olivia called yesterday. She was distraught. She said you were not yourself." "I am more myself than I have been in years, David," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "Trust me." Olivia and James were the last to arrive, and their entrance was a masterpiece of manipulative stagecraft. Olivia was dressed in a simple dark blue dress, her hair pulled back, her face pale and sorrowful. She looked like a tragic heroine from a Victorian novel. James wore a somber suit and a pained expression, as if the weight of the world were on his shoulders. They greeted their aunt and uncle with long, mournful hugs, whispering things I couldn't hear but could easily imagine. "Thank you for coming. It means so much. We just don't understand." We gathered around the large mahogany dining table, the one Robert had proudly built in his workshop, its surface gleaming under the soft light of the chandelier. The conversation was stilted at first, a minefield of safe topics: the weather, sports, Carol's upcoming trip to Florida. Olivia and James were impeccable. They were attentive, respectful, and deeply, profoundly sad. They passed the serving dishes to me first. They laughed gently at their uncle's old jokes. They were building their case, brick by painstaking brick, for their audience of two. They were the victims. I was the unstable, grieving widow making a terrible mistake. I played my part as well. I was quiet, gracious, and a little distant, allowing them to fill the space with their performance. I let them weave their web of deception, knowing that soon I would be the spider. As the dessert plates were being passed, Olivia chose her moment. With a trembling hand, she raised her wine glass. A single, perfect tear glistened on her eyelash. I know this is difficult," she began, her voice catching beautifully. "And I just wanted to say, to my family—" She eyes swept over David and Carol, a look of heartbreaking sincerity on her face. "How much I love all of you, and how much I miss my dad." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I feel him in this house every day.
He built it not just with wood and nails, but with love. He wanted us to be safe here. He wanted us to be a family, together, in this home. She turned her tear-filled eyes to me. And Mom, I know you're hurting. We all are. But I hope you know that no matter what happens, this will always be the house that Dad's love built. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor his memory and the family he gave us. She sat down to a hushed, emotional silence. Carol was openly weeping into her napkin. David looked at me, his expression a mixture of pity for Olivia and deep concern for me. The jury was swayed. They had presented their closing argument, and it was powerful. I let the silence stretch, letting her words hang in the air like a sweet, poisonous perfume. I let my family absorb the full impact of her heartfelt plea. Then, slowly, deliberately, I placed my napkin on the table and stood up. My hands were steady. My voice, when it came, was not filled with the emotion they expected. It was calm, clear, and carried the chilling weight of absolute truth. That was a lovely sentiment, Olivia, and you are absolutely right. This is the house that your father's love built. I reached down to the large tote bag I had placed on the floor beside my chair. I pulled out a thick, official portfolio bound in dark blue leather. It was the same one from the safe. I walked around the table, my footsteps the only sound in the dead-still room, and I placed it on the table, directly in front of my daughter. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "And this," I said, my voice dropping just enough to make them all lean in, "is the invoice." The blue leather portfolio sat on the table like an unexploded bomb. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with a sudden palpable tension. The sympathetic, teary-eyed atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a sharp, questioning silence. Everyone stared at the portfolio, then at me, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning apprehension. Olivia looked at it as if it were venomous, her hand hovering over it, afraid to touch it. What is this, Mom?" she finally whispered, the carefully crafted sorrow in her voice replaced by a thin, reedy fear. "It's a story," I said, my voice even and measured. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of my brother-in-law and sister-in-law. "It's the real story of this house. Please, Olivia, open it." With a hand that visibly trembled, she reached out and flipped open the cover. The document on top was not some dusty old deed. It was a crisp, official letter, the letterhead stark and imposing. Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. The subject line was clear. Confirmation of death benefit payout. Insured, Robert J. Richardson. Beneficiary, Martha A. Richardson. Payout amount, $350,000. The date of the transaction was clearly visible. August 14th, 5 years ago, less than 3 months after Robert's funeral. I watched the blood drain from Olivia's face. She made a small choking sound, her eyes scanning the page again and again as if the words might change. James leaned over her shoulder, his face going slack-jawed with disbelief. It was David, Robert's brother, who finally spoke, his voice a low rumble of confusion. "Martha, I don't understand. What does this have to do with the house?" I drew a deep breath and addressed the entire table, my voice resonating with the clarity of a bell in the silent room. "You all heard Olivia's beautiful speech. She spoke of how this house was her father's legacy of love. She is more right than she knows." I gestured towards the insurance document. Robert was a planner. He was a good man who worried about the future. For 25 years, he paid the premiums on that life insurance policy. When his contracting business struggled, he took side jobs to make the payments. When I wanted to go on a cruise, he said, "Maybe next year, honey. I've got to make sure the policy is paid up." He did it for one reason, to know that if he were gone, his family, that Olivia, would be safe and secure. I paused, letting the weight of his sacrifice settle over them. When he died, that check for $350,000 arrived, and I used every last cent of it, plus some of our savings, to buy this house. Outright. No mortgage. I bought it so my daughter and her husband could start their life together without the burden of debt, in a beautiful, safe home. I locked my gaze on Olivia. Her face was a ruin. I never told you, Olivia, because I didn't want you to feel like you were living in a house bought by your father's death. I wanted you to feel it was a gift of life, a gift of a mother's love, not a monument to our grief. I wanted you to be happy.
I let the silence hang for a beat. Then I delivered the killing blow. My voice dropped, becoming quiet, but each word was laced with ice. And in this house, this sanctuary that your father's love and sacrifice built, you refused me a glass of water when I came home from the hospital after my heart had literally stopped beating. In this house, you called me a burden and a servant. In this house, you locked me in my room and conspired to steal from me. You stood here just moments ago, and you weaponized your father's memory, using it as a shield for your own greed and cruelty. A collective, audible gasp came from Carol. She stared at Olivia, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. David's face hardened, his eyes, so like Robert's, fixing on James with a look of utter disgust. The jury had seen the evidence. The verdict was unanimous. "You talk about honoring his memory?" I continued, my voice shaking now with a righteous fury I could no longer contain. "You dishonor him with every breath you take in this house. He died thinking he had provided for a loving family who would care for each other. He never would have imagined his final act of love would be used to enable such profound, ugly selfishness." That was it. The facade didn't just crack, it exploded. Olivia let out a strangled, animal sound of pure despair. She shoved her chair back so violently that it toppled over, and she fled the room, her hands covering her face, her sobs echoing through the house. James was left alone at the table, exposed under the harsh glare of his family's judgment. He tried to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but David cut him off, his voice like thunder. "Get out," David said, his voice low and shaking with rage. "Get out of my brother's house." Carol, her face streaked with tears, stood up and walked not to me, but to the portfolio on the table. She gently closed it, as if closing the cover on a coffin. "He was the best of us," she whispered, looking at me with eyes full of shared grief and newfound understanding. "And he deserved better than this." James stumbled to his feet and scurried from the room after his wife. The dinner party was over, the truth was out, and the house, finally, was beginning to feel like mine again. The silence that descended upon the house after they left was absolute. David and Carol stayed for another hour, their presence a quiet, comforting blanket. We didn't talk much. We sat in the living room, sipping coffee, the wreckage of the dinner party still on the table in the next room. There were no apologies needed, no explanations required. They understood. They had seen the truth laid bare, and their quiet solidarity was more healing than any words could have been. When they finally left, Carol hugged me tightly at the door. She said, "You call us, Martha, for anything. You are not alone." The days that followed were a blur of quiet activity. There was no more pleading from Olivia, no more blustering from James. Their public humiliation had been total. They packed their belongings with a funereal quiet, moving like ashamed ghosts through the rooms they had once lorded over. They were shadows in my house, and I simply moved around them, my presence a constant, silent judgment. On the final day of the 30-day notice, a cheap, battered rental truck rumbled into the driveway. I watched from the living room window as they loaded their life into its grimy interior. It was a surprisingly small collection of things.
the possessions of people who had spent their money on experiences and appearances rather than substance. When the last box was loaded, Olivia came inside alone. She stood hesitating in the doorway, a wraith in the afternoon light. Her face was thin and pale, the arrogant confidence she once wore like a suit of armor now gone, leaving only a raw, bruised vulnerability. She was holding the house keys. She walked slowly to the coffee table where I was sitting and placed the keys on the polished wood surface. The small clinking sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Mom," she began, her voice a hoarse whisper. I'm sorry." It was a pathetic little phrase, wholly inadequate for the chasm that lay between us. "I didn't know about the insurance, about where the money came from. If I had known—" I held up a hand, stopping her. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks, not as an adversary, but as the daughter I had raised. And I felt a profound, aching sadness. "It wouldn't have mattered, Olivia," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "The source of the money doesn't change the actions. It only changes the degree of the sacrilege. You didn't need to know about the insurance policy to know how to treat your mother with basic human decency. You didn't need a financial statement to know that you don't lock a person in a room. The money is not the point. The cruelty was the point." Tears began to stream silently down her face. "So, what now? Is this it? Are we done?" I considered her question. Was it done? The legal battle was over, the cohabitation was over, but the relationship? That had been over long before I called my lawyer. "The relationship you and I had is done, yes." And the finality of the words hung in the air. That mother, the one who would have forgiven anything, the one who kept writing checks and making excuses, she died in this house a few weeks ago. I don't know who I am now, but I am not her. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rental truck, at James sitting in the passenger seat, staring blankly ahead. What you need to do now is to take a long, hard look at the person you have become. You need to figure out why you thought it was acceptable to treat another human being, let alone your own mother, with such contempt. You need to rebuild your life on a foundation of something real, not just entitlement. If you can do that, if you can become a person your father would have been proud of, then maybe one day you can begin to forgive yourself. But that is your journey, not mine." I heard her take a shaky breath. A moment later, the front door opened and closed with a soft click. I listened as the truck's engine sputtered to life. I watched it pull away from the curb, turn the corner, and disappear. And then there was only peace. In the weeks and months that followed, the house began to breathe again. It began to feel like mine. I moved my own furniture back into the master bedroom. I hung the picture of Robert and me back over the mantelpiece. I started working in the garden, my hands in the rich soil, feeling a connection to the earth, to the life that Robert and I had built. Frank Henderson became a good friend. He'd come over with coffee, and we'd sit on the porch and talk for hours. We never spoke of Olivia or James. We spoke of the past, of our lives, our spouses, our joys and sorrows. His quiet, steadfast friendship was a balm to my wounded soul.
One day, I was in the study and I opened the safe. I took out the blue leather portfolio, the Richardson Family Revocable Living Trust, Robert's final gift. He had tried to build a fortress to protect us. He couldn't have known that the greatest threat would come not from the outside world, but from within our own walls. I closed the portfolio and put it away. I didn't need it anymore. I had fought my own battle. I had defended my own fortress. I had survived. And in the quiet, sun-filled rooms of my house, surrounded by the memories of a great love and the strength I had found within myself, I was finally, truly home.